The plasma burn across Jake Morrison's shoulder felt like someone had decided to brand him with a particularly enthusiastic cattle iron, except the cattle iron happened to be powered by a small star and wielded by rebel forces with questionable aim. His reconnaissance pod had crumpled against the forest floor of Zelythra like an expensive piece of origami that someone had enthusiastically stomped on, leaving him with nothing but a malfunctioning comm unit, a plasma rifle with exactly 3 shots remaining, and the growing suspicion that his military insurance probably didn't cover acts of alien hostility. The trees around him hummed with an otherworldly resonance that made his teeth ache, their bioluminescent bark pulsing in patterns that reminded him uncomfortably of his ex-girlfriend's mood ring collection. Each trunk twisted skyward in impossible spirals, their canopy so dense that the alien sun filtered through in scattered beams of violet and gold. The air itself seemed to shimmer with microscopic particles that his scanner insisted were perfectly breathable but tasted faintly of cinnamon and regret. "Well, Mr. Whiskers," he muttered to the photo tucked inside his helmet, "looks like Daddy's going to be late for dinner again." The image of his orange tabby cat stared back with typical feline judgment, as if to say that crash landing on an uncharted planet was exactly the sort of irresponsible behavior one might expect from someone who thought naming a cat Mr. Whiskers was peak creativity. His shoulder throbbed with each heartbeat, the plasma burn having cauterized itself but leaving behind a wound that pulsed with an eerie blue-white light. Standard military training suggested he should find shelter, establish a perimeter, and attempt to contact his unit. Reality suggested he should probably stop bleeding first, then worry about explaining to his commanding officer why he'd managed to lose a 1,000,000-credit reconnaissance vessel to what the briefing had described as primitive hostiles with pointy sticks. The forest floor crunched beneath his boots as he stumbled forward, each step sending fresh waves of pain through his damaged shoulder. The undergrowth seemed to part before him with an almost deliberate quality, as if the planet itself was guiding his path. His scanner detected no immediate threats, but it also insisted that the trees were singing in harmonies that shouldn't exist outside of a particularly experimental jazz club. A sound like crystalline wind chimes caught his attention, followed by what could only be described as the galaxy's most melodious argument. Voices drifted through the glowing forest, speaking in a language that his universal translator struggled to parse. The words seemed to flow like liquid music, rising and falling in cadences that suggested either poetry or a very polite discussion about who had forgotten to feed the space llamas. Jake pressed himself against one of the humming trees, wincing as the vibration sent fresh jolts of pain through his wound. Through the luminescent undergrowth, he could make out figures moving with fluid grace that made human ballet look like interpretive construction work. They were tall, elegant, and carried weapons that appeared to be carved from living crystal, each one glowing with the same soft radiance as the forest around them. His breath caught as the group's leader stepped into a shaft of filtered sunlight. She moved with the kind of unconscious nobility that suggested she'd never had to worry about student loans or whether her car would pass inspection. Her hair cascaded down her back in waves that seemed to catch and hold the alien light, and her features were undeniably humanoid except for the delicately pointed ears that swept back from her temples like evolutionary exclamation marks. "Oh, come on," Jake whispered to himself, "aliens with elf ears? What's next, space wizards? Intergalactic dentists?" His shoulder chose that moment to send another spike of agony through his nervous system, reminding him that his current situation was considerably less amusing than his internal commentary suggested. The alien woman raised her hand, and her companions fell silent with the kind of immediate obedience that spoke of either deep respect or healthy fear of detention. She tilted her head, those elegant ears twitching slightly, and Jake realized with growing horror that she was listening. His heartbeat seemed thunderous in the crystalline silence, each pulse echoing like a drum solo at a meditation retreat. She turned toward his hiding spot with predatory grace, her eyes the color of storm clouds over an electric sea. For a moment that stretched like bad elevator music, they stared at each other across the bioluminescent divide. Jake found himself thinking that if he was about to be vaporized by alien technology, at least his executioner was aesthetically pleasing. "Well," he said, stepping out from behind the tree with his hands raised in what he hoped was the universal gesture for, "Please don't disintegrate me, this is either going really well or really badly, and I'm not sure which option I prefer." The alien woman's eyes widened, not with fear but with something that looked suspiciously like curiosity. Her companions raised their crystal weapons with fluid precision, the points beginning to glow with contained energy that made Jake's scanner emit worried beeping sounds. But she held up a hand, and the weapons lowered slightly, though they remained ready to turn him into a Jake-shaped scorch mark at a moment's notice. His universal translator finally caught up with the conversation, offering helpful suggestions like, "Greetings, fellow sentient being," and, "I come in peace, please don't hurt me." Instead, Jake heard himself saying, "I don't suppose any of you know a good emergency room? I seem to have had a slight disagreement with some unfriendly plasma fire." The princess stepped closer, her gaze fixed on his wounded shoulder with an intensity that made him acutely aware of how ridiculous he must look. His uniform was torn and scorched, his hair was doing things that violated several laws of physics, and he was pretty sure he smelled like a combination of ozone and panic sweat. "You're wound," she said, her voice carrying the kind of musical quality that suggested her people had evolved past the need for autotune. "It bears the mark of our energy signatures." Jake looked down at his shoulder, noting for the first time that the plasma burn was indeed glowing with the same soft radiance as the forest around them. "Yeah, well, that's what happens when you get shot by weapons that probably cost more than my annual salary. I don't suppose this means I get some kind of warranty coverage." The alien guards exchanged glances that conveyed entire conversations worth of concern and confusion. Their leader continued to stare at his wound with the kind of fascination usually reserved for particularly engaging puzzle boxes or cats doing inexplicably adorable things. "This should not be possible," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Humans are immune to our bioenergy systems. Your species lacks the genetic markers necessary for harmonic resonance." "Well, that's awkward," Jake replied, swaying slightly as another wave of dizziness washed over him. "I hate to break it to you, but I'm apparently defying your scientific expectations while simultaneously bleeding on your very nice forest floor. My mother always said I was special, but I assumed she meant it in the 'please try not to set anything on fire' way." The princess looked at him with an expression that suggested she was rapidly recalculating several fundamental assumptions about the universe. Behind her, the largest of the guards muttered something that the translator helpfully rendered as either "unprecedented anomaly" or "really big problem," depending on context. Jake's vision began to blur around the edges, the bioluminescent forest taking on a dreamlike quality that suggested his body had decided to prioritize bleeding over consciousness. "You know," he said conversationally, "I'm starting to think this might be one of those situations where I should have read the fine print before accepting the mission." He collapsed forward, his last conscious thought being that if he was going to pass out in front of alien royalty, he really should have worn cleaner underwear. Jake woke up feeling like someone had replaced his blood with carbonated electricity and his bones with tuning forks that had been enthusiastically struck by a cosmic orchestra. The ceiling above him pulsed with soft geometric patterns that shifted between colors his eyes insisted didn't exist on any reasonable spectrum, which meant either he was hallucinating or alien interior decorators had very different ideas about restful environments. "Ah, you're conscious," came a melodious voice from somewhere to his left. We were beginning to wonder if human neural patterns required specific gravitational frequencies to maintain coherence. Jake turned his head, wincing as the movement sent fresh complaints from muscles he'd forgotten he owned. Princess Lyralii sat beside what appeared to be a chair grown from living crystal, her elegant ears twitching with what he was beginning to recognize as either curiosity or mild exasperation. Her silver robes seemed to flow like liquid starlight, making him acutely aware that his torn military fatigues probably violated several fashion laws across multiple galaxies. "Where am I?" he asked, his voice coming out as a croak that would have made his high school drama teacher weep with disappointment. "And please tell me this isn't the part where you reveal I'm in some kind of alien medical experiment involving uncomfortable probing." "You are in the crystal sanctum beneath our capital city," she replied, gesturing to the chamber around them. "Our healers have been attempting to understand your unique physiological responses to our bioenergy systems. The probing you mentioned sounds unnecessarily invasive." The room itself defied several fundamental principles of architecture Jake thought were universal. Walls curved in impossible directions, meeting at angles that his brain refused to process correctly. Streams of luminescent liquid flowed along channels carved into the floor, creating patterns that seemed to respond to his heartbeat with synchronized pulses of light. Right, the bioenergy thing, Jake said, attempting to sit up and immediately regretting the decision as his shoulder reminded him about their recent plasma encounter. I don't suppose you have any of those little hospital gowns that never close properly in the back. Because this whole, wounded hero in alien healing chamber, situation feels like it needs more wardrobe malfunctions to reach peak awkwardness. A new voice interrupted from across the chamber, speaking in tones that suggested disapproval had been refined into an art form. Princess, the human's metabolic readings continue to fluctuate in patterns that violate established xenobiological principles. His genetic markers should make him completely incompatible with our harmonic frequencies. Jake turned to see what appeared to be the galaxy's most serious librarian, if librarians wore robes that looked like they'd been woven from mathematical equations and carried devices that hummed with barely contained scientific fury. The being's ears were longer than the princess's, swept back in elegant curves that suggested either advanced evolution or really dedicated styling. Dr. Valen believes you represent an unprecedented anomaly in interspecies biological compatibility, Princess Lyralii explained, her tone carrying just enough amusement to suggest she found the good doctor's scientific distress mildly entertaining. Your wound is healing at rates that should be theoretically impossible for human physiology. Jake looked down at his shoulder, noting that the plasma burn had indeed faded to little more than a faint luminescent scar that pulsed in rhythm with the streams flowing through the chamber floor. Well, that's convenient. Does this mean I get to keep the glow-in-the-dark feature, or is that going to fade once your cosmic warranty expires? The bioluminescence appears to be permanent, Dr. Valen said, consulting a device that looked like a crystalline tablet having an argument with a small constellation. Your cellular structure has integrated our healing matrix in ways that suggest genetic compatibility at levels we've never observed between human and Zelithan physiology. Fantastic, Jake replied. I always wanted to be a walking nightlight. My cat is going to have so many questions. Princess Lyralii's lips quirked upward in what might have been the beginning of a smile. You mention this cat frequently. Is it a significant relationship in your culture? Mr. Whiskers is my roommate, confidant, and harshest critic, Jake explained solemnly. He judges my life choices with the kind of devastating accuracy that suggests he might actually be the smartest being in our apartment. Which, given my current situation, is looking increasingly likely. The princess made a sound that could have been a laugh if it weren't so musical and refined. Dr. Valen, meanwhile, was running increasingly frantic scans with instruments that beeped in harmonies Jake was beginning to suspect were actually curse words in some advanced scientific dialect. Princess, the doctor said urgently, his bioresonance patterns are synchronizing with the sanctum's core matrix. This level of harmonic integration hasn't been recorded since the ancient texts spoke of the star-touched ones. The what now? Jake asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. Princess Lyralii's expression shifted to something more serious, though her eyes retained their spark of curiosity. Old prophecies speak of beings who would bridge the gap between worlds, whose presence would awaken dormant energies in our most sacred sites. Most scholars assumed they were metaphorical. Well, that's just perfect, Jake muttered. I crash land on an alien planet, get shot by rebels, and apparently fulfill ancient prophecies just by existing. My mother always said I had a gift for overcomplicating simple situations. As if summoned by his words, the chamber's walls began to pulse with new patterns of light that seemed to respond directly to his presence. The streams of luminescent liquid flowed faster, creating intricate designs that looked suspiciously like star charts mixed with what Jake could only describe as cosmic doodles. Dr. Valen dropped his scanning device, which hit the floor with a sound like breaking wind chimes. Impossible. The sanctum is responding to his presence as if he were one of the ancient bloodlines. But he's human. His DNA should be completely incompatible with our harmonic technologies. Maybe your scanning equipment needs better customer service, Jake suggested helpfully. Have you tried turning it off and on again? That usually works for my coffee maker. The princess stood and approached his healing chamber, her movement causing the room's light patterns to shift and dance around her like adoring fireflies. "Jake Morrison of Earth," she said formally, "your presence here may not be the coincidence we initially believed." "Are you telling me I'm some kind of chosen one?" Jake asked with growing alarm. "Because I have to warn you, I'm really not qualified for that sort of responsibility. I once killed a houseplant by looking at it wrong, and my idea of strategic thinking involves deciding whether to have pizza or Chinese food for dinner." The ancient texts suggest that the Star-Touched would arrive during times of great change, bearing wounds that would heal with our light and wisdom that would bridge our peoples, Princess Lyralii continued, ignoring his protests. They also mentioned that such beings would possess great humor in the face of cosmic significance. "Oh, come on," Jake said. "You can't seriously be suggesting that my complete inability to take anything seriously is some kind of prophetic qualification. That's like saying someone's destined for greatness because they're really good at making inappropriate jokes during funeral services." Dr. Valen scrambled to retrieve his fallen equipment while muttering what the translator insisted were either scientific observations or increasingly creative profanity. The chamber around them continued to pulse and flow with energy that seemed to dance to the rhythm of Jake's heartbeat, creating a light show that would have been beautiful if it weren't so obviously significant. "The synchronization patterns are stabilizing," the doctor announced with the kind of reluctant amazement usually reserved for discovering that one's least favorite theory might actually be correct. "His biorhythms are achieving perfect harmonic resonance with our most sacred technologies. This shouldn't be possible unless—" "Unless what?" Princess Lyralii asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "Unless human and Zelithan DNA share common ancestry," Dr. Valen whispered, his scientific worldview apparently crumbling around his elegantly pointed ears. "But that would mean our species are related, despite evolving on worlds separated by thousands of light-years." Jake looked between the princess and the doctor, both of whom were staring at him with expressions that suggested he'd just announced he was secretly made of cheese. "So let me get this straight. I crash land on your planet, get healed by your magic crystals, accidentally activate your ancient technology, and now you're telling me we might be cosmic cousins?" "It would explain the unprecedented compatibility," Princess Lyralii mused, her scientific curiosity clearly warring with what appeared to be growing personal interest. "And your natural ability to synchronize with our harmonic systems. This is either the best or worst family reunion in galactic history," Jake observed. "Do I get a welcome basket, or do people usually run screaming when they discover they're related to someone who manages to cause interdimensional incidents just by bleeding in the wrong place?" The princess's smile was answer enough, even as Dr. Valen continued to mutter about impossible genetic matrices and the urgent need to contact the High Council. Jake settled back into his healing chamber, watching the lights dance around him in patterns that seemed almost familiar, like half-remembered dreams of home among stars he'd never seen. The Zelithan High Council chamber looked like someone had asked a committee of architects to design a room using only crystals, impossible geometry, and what Jake was beginning to suspect was an unhealthy obsession with dramatic lighting. 12 beings sat in chairs that appeared to be carved from single pieces of singing stone, their elongated ears twitching with the kind of synchronized disapproval that suggested Jake's presence had become the galaxy's most uncomfortable topic of conversation. "Princess Lyralii," intoned the eldest council member, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent centuries perfecting the art of making people feel small, "you bring before us a human whose very existence violates the fundamental principles of our understanding of interspecies biology." Jake shifted uncomfortably in what he'd been told was the seat of truth, though it felt more like the chair of awkward questions. His shoulder still glowed with that faint bioluminescence, which had become increasingly problematic since discovering that it seemed to activate every piece of Zelithan technology within a 50-meter radius. The council chamber's walls now pulsed in response to his heartbeat, creating what looked like a cosmic mood ring the size of a small cathedral. "Counselor Thyvan," Princess Lyralii replied with the kind of diplomatic patience that suggested she'd had this argument before, "the human Jake Morrison represents an unprecedented opportunity to understand the deeper connections between our species. His genetic compatibility with our biosystem suggests possibilities we haven't considered. Or, said another council member, her ears practically bristling with scientific skepticism, he represents a threat to the natural order that has kept our species secure for millennia. Counselor Vex speaks wisdom in urging caution. Jake raised his hand like a student asking permission to visit the bathroom. Excuse me, but I'm sitting right here. If you're going to discuss whether I'm a cosmic miracle or a galactic security threat, maybe I should get a vote. I promise to recuse myself if there's a conflict of interest. The council members exchanged glances that conveyed entire dissertations worth of concern. Counselor Thiven's expression suggested Jake had just committed a breach of protocol that might require consultation with legal scholars and possibly a small army of etiquette experts. The human speaks out of turn, muttered Counselor Vex, her tone implying that speaking out of turn was somewhere between jaywalking and interplanetary war crimes on the scale of social violations. In my defense, Jake continued cheerfully, I don't actually know when my turn is supposed to be. Your diplomatic customs weren't covered in basic military training, probably because most first-contact scenarios don't involve accidentally becoming a walking light show. Princess Lyraliai's lips quirked upward in what was becoming a familiar expression of amused exasperation. The human raises a valid point about cultural differences, honored counselors. Perhaps we should focus on the scientific implications rather than protocol violations. The scientific implications are precisely what concern us, said a counselor whose ears were so elaborately decorated with crystalline ornaments that Jake wondered if they were functional or purely aesthetic. Dr. Valen's preliminary reports suggest that this human's presence activates dormant systems throughout our capital city. Several ancient monuments have begun displaying energy patterns unseen for centuries. Wait, what now? Jake asked, his casual demeanor slipping slightly. I'm activating monuments. Are we talking about tourist attractions or something more significant, like giant laser defense systems that might accidentally vaporize passing spacecraft? The pillars of first light have begun resonating with harmonic frequencies that match the ancient star songs, Dr. Valen announced from his position near what appeared to be a lectern grown from living coral. The memorial of the deep voyagers has started projecting stellar coordinates that predate our recorded history. And the fountain of eternal questions has begun providing answers. That last one sounds ominous, Jake observed. Please tell me the answers aren't things like, the end is near, or, you should have read the fine print. Because my track record with important fine print is already questionable. Counselor Thiven leaned forward with the kind of intensity that suggested Jake had stumbled onto something significant. The fountain of eternal questions has remained silent for over 3,000 years. It was built by the first architects, who claimed it would only speak again when the star-touched returned to bridge the gap between worlds. And there's that prophecy thing again, Jake sighed. Look, I appreciate the cosmic significance and all, but I really think you might have the wrong guy. I'm not exactly bridge-building material. I once got into an argument with an automatic door because I couldn't figure out which way it was supposed to open. Your humility may itself be part of the prophecy, Princess Lyraliai suggested, though her tone carried just enough uncertainty to suggest she was improvising. The ancient texts speak of one who would unite worlds through wisdom disguised as folly. That's either deeply philosophical or a really elaborate way of saying I'm too dumb to realize how important this is, Jake replied. Either way, I'm starting to feel like I should be charging consulting fees for accidentally fulfilling ancient prophecies. The chamber's walls pulsed with a sudden surge of brilliant light that made everyone's eyes water and caused several council members to emit sounds of alarm that the translator rendered as variations on, "oh dear," mixed with what might have been early scientific hypotheses about impending doom. The resonance cascade is accelerating, Dr. Valen announced with the kind of clinical detachment that suggested he was documenting the end of the world for posterity. The human's biosignature is synchronizing with the city's core matrix at unprecedented rates. Is that bad? Jake asked, though the increasing intensity of the light show around him suggested the answer was probably somewhere between concerning and time to update your will. Unknown, Dr. Valen replied unhelpfully. This level of harmonic integration has no precedent in our historical records. We are essentially conducting real-time xenobiological research with potentially civilization-altering implications. Fantastic, Jake muttered. I always wanted to be a case study. My high school guidance counselor will be so proud. Counselor Vex stood abruptly, her ornate robes swirling around her like crystalline thunderclouds. This human represents an unacceptable risk to our people. His uncontrolled activation of sacred sites could destabilize the harmonic networks that protect our cities. Or, Princess Lyralii countered with growing confidence, his presence could unlock technologies and wisdom that our ancestors left for exactly this moment. The prophecies exist for a reason. Prophecies are interpretation, not instruction, Counselor Thyvan said severely. We cannot base the security of our civilization on ancient poetry and the unprecedented biology of a single human. Jake watched the debate swirl around him, noting that the chamber's light patterns were shifting from the gentle pulses he'd grown accustomed to toward something more urgent and complex. The walls now displayed what looked suspiciously like star maps mixed with mathematical equations and what his military training recognized as tactical deployment patterns. Excuse me again, he said, raising his hand higher. I don't want to interrupt what I'm sure is a very important argument about my cosmic significance, but I think your room is trying to tell us something. The council members turned to look at the walls, their expressions shifting from political concern to scientific alarm as they realized that the chamber was now displaying information that none of them had requested. The patterns flowing across the crystalline surfaces showed star systems, fleet movements, and energy signatures that looked uncomfortably familiar to someone who'd recently been shot down by rebel forces. Those are military formations, Jake said with growing unease, his casual humor fading as he recognized the tactical implications. And unless I'm misreading your cosmic PowerPoint presentation, they're heading this way. Dr. Valen frantically consulted his instruments while muttering what were definitely scientific curse words. The harmonic resonance has activated the Deep Watch protocols. The city's ancient defense grid is detecting approaching vessels with hostile energy signatures. The human's presence has awakened our most protected systems, Princess Lyralii breathed, her scientific excitement warring with obvious concern. Systems that have slept since the first architects departed. Great, Jake said, watching the star maps shift to show fleet positions that were definitely closer than they'd been moments before. So let me get this straight. I crash land on your planet, accidentally fulfill your ancient prophecies, activate your sleeping defense networks, and now I'm apparently broadcasting a cosmic come and get me signal to whoever might be interested in uninvited galactic tourism. The approaching vessels matched the energy signatures of the ships that attacked you, Counselor Vex announced grimly. It appears your rebel pursuers have followed you to our world. Of course they have, Jake sighed, settling back in the seat of truth as the chamber around them continued its increasingly urgent light show. Because nothing says diplomatic incident like accidentally starting an interplanetary war while trying to figure out alien bathroom facilities. Princess Lyralii moved closer to his chair, her presence somehow stabilizing the chaotic energy patterns flowing around them. Jake Morrison, it appears that your destiny and ours are more intertwined than any of us anticipated. Yeah, well, Jake replied, watching the tactical displays show enemy fleets converging on Zelathan space. I really hope that destiny includes a plan for dealing with hostile visitors, because I'm pretty sure my insurance doesn't cover acts of cosmic significance either. The rebel fleet hung in Zelathan space like an unwelcome dinner party that had shown up 3 hours early and brought their own aggressive conversation topics. Jake stood on the crystalline observation deck of the capital's highest spire, watching enemy ships arrange themselves in what his military training recognized as a classic intimidation formation, though he suspected the rebels had missed the memo about trying to intimidate a planet whose defense systems were apparently older than most civilizations. They're hailing us, Princess Lyralii announced, her elegant ears twitching with what Jake had learned to recognize as controlled irritation mixed with diplomatic necessity. She wore ceremonial armor that looked like someone had convinced starlight to hold still long enough to be forged into protective wear, though Jake noticed she still managed to make intergalactic crisis management look effortless. Let me guess, Jake said, his shoulders bioluminescent scar pulsing in rhythm with the ancient defense networks that continued to hum around them like the galaxy's most enthusiastic security system. They want to discuss my extended warranty or maybe offer me a great deal on life insurance. The main view screen materialized in the air before them, displaying the scarred face of Commander Crow, whose expression suggested he'd been having a very bad week that was about to get considerably worse. Behind him, the bridge of his flagship buzzed with the kind of barely controlled chaos that indicated someone had seriously miscalculated the difficulty of their current mission. Princess Lyralii of the Zelithan court, Crow announced with the kind of forced formality that suggested he'd been practicing his diplomatic speech while secretly hoping he wouldn't have to use it. We demand the immediate surrender of the human operative Jake Morrison. His interference in our operations has cost us significant resources. Define significant, Jake called out cheerfully, stepping into view of the communication array. Because I'm genuinely curious about the accounting principles you use for measuring the cost of shooting down someone who was just trying to mind his own business. Commander Crow's expression shifted through several stages of recognition, surprise, and what appeared to be growing existential dread. Morrison. You were reported as terminated in the engagement over Vega Prime. Greatly exaggerated, as it turns out, Jake replied with a grin that he hoped conveyed the appropriate level of casual confidence mixed with cosmic significance. Though I did get a really interesting souvenir from the experience. He gestured to his glowing shoulder, which chose that moment to pulse with enough harmonic resonance to make every Zelithan defensive system within 50 kilometers hum in sympathetic response. The effect on the rebel fleet was immediate and impressive. Their ship's formation wavered as proximity alarms began screaming warnings about energy signatures that predated their tactical databases. Several vessels started backing away from the planet with the kind of urgent maneuvering that suggested their captains had suddenly remembered important appointments elsewhere in the galaxy. What have you done? Crow demanded, his voice carrying the kind of panic that indicated he was beginning to realize that shooting down Jake over an uncharted planet might not have been his most strategically sound decision. Well, that's a complicated question, Jake mused, settling into what had become his favorite philosophical discussion stance. Technically, I crashed, got healed by some very nice aliens, accidentally activated a bunch of ancient technology, fulfilled a few prophecies, and discovered that humans and Zelithans are probably distant cousins. Oh, and I made friends with a princess who has excellent taste in defensive architecture. Princess Lyralii stepped beside him, her presence causing the planetary defense grid to shift into what Jake recognized as a protective configuration that surrounded the rebel fleet with enough firepower to reclassify several asteroids. Commander Crow, you have entered Zelithan space in pursuit of an individual who is now under the protection of our ancient accords. Your continued presence here constitutes an act of aggression. The human is a military operative of the Terran colonial forces, Crow protested, though his tone suggested he was beginning to understand that legal technicalities might not carry much weight with a civilization whose weapon systems were older than his species' recorded history. Actually, Jake interjected with the kind of timing that suggested he'd been waiting for exactly this moment, I think there might be some confusion about my current employment status. See, when I crashed on this lovely planet and got integrated into the local harmonic defense matrix, I'm pretty sure my original job description became somewhat obsolete. Dr. Valen materialized beside them with the kind of urgent energy that suggested he'd been running through corridors while simultaneously conducting xenobiological research. Princess, the resonance cascade has stabilized at unprecedented levels. The human's biosignature has achieved complete integration with our planetary systems. He is, quite literally, part of our world now. So what you're telling me, Jake said with growing amusement, is that I've accidentally quit my day job and become some kind of cosmic citizen through the power of uncontrolled bleeding and harmonic frequencies. The ancient protocols are quite clear, Princess Lyralii confirmed, her smile suggesting she was enjoying this particular diplomatic revelation. Any being who achieves harmonic integration with our planetary matrix is considered a child of Zelithra, with all the rights and protections that status entails. Commander Crow's face was cycling through colors that probably weren't healthy for his species. This is preposterous. You cannot simply adopt enemy operatives because they happen to synchronize with your technology. Enemy is a strong word, Jake observed, watching the defensive systems continue to demonstrate just how thoroughly outgunned the rebel fleet had become. I prefer incompatible workplace personalities or maybe creative differences regarding who gets shot at. Plus, I think the adoption papers have already been processed by several thousand years' worth of prophetic precedent. The princess moved closer to him, her hand finding his uninjured arm with the kind of gesture that managed to be both diplomatic and personal. Jake Morrison of Earth, do you accept the protection and citizenship of Zalithra, with all the responsibilities and privileges such status entails? Jake looked at the rebel fleet, still hanging in space with their weapons powered but increasingly useless against technology that had been ancient when their civilization was still figuring out basic metallurgy. He thought about his small apartment back on Earth, his job flying reconnaissance missions for people who shot at him, and Mr. Whiskers, who would probably adjust to interplanetary living with typical feline adaptability. You know what? He said finally, his shoulder pulsing with light that seemed to synchronize with something deep in the planet's core. I've always been terrible at traditional career planning anyway. Plus, the benefits package here includes cosmic significance and really impressive defensive capabilities. Then by the ancient laws and the harmonic resonance that binds you to our world, Princess Lyralii declared formally, I welcome you as a true child of Zalithra. The effect was immediate and spectacular. Every defensive system on the planet harmonized in a crescendo of energy that made the aurora borealis look like a small flashlight. The rebel fleet found themselves surrounded by protective barriers that were simultaneously beautiful and absolutely terrifying, held in place by technology that politely but firmly suggested they might want to reconsider their career choices. This is your final warning, Commander Crow, Princess Lyralii announced with the kind of diplomatic finality that sounded like silk wrapped around titanium. Depart our space immediately, or face the consequences of threatening a citizen under the protection of the first architects. Commander Crow stared at the displays showing his fleet completely outmaneuvered by systems his sensors couldn't even properly identify. This isn't over, Morrison. Actually, I think it kind of is, Jake replied cheerfully. Unless you want to stick around and see what other ancient technology my presence accidentally activates. I hear there might be some really interesting automated defense platforms that haven't had visitors in a few millennia. The rebel fleet departed with the kind of speed that suggested they'd suddenly remembered urgent appointments in completely different star systems. Jake watched them go, noting that his shoulder had stopped pulsing quite so urgently now that the immediate threat had passed. So, he said, turning to Princess Lyralii with a grin that felt more genuine than any expression he'd worn in years, what exactly does being a child of Zalithra involve? Please tell me there are instruction manuals, because my track record with figuring out alien customs through trial and error is already pretty questionable. There will be time to learn, she replied, her eyes holding promises of shared adventures among stars he'd never imagined. Though I suspect your unique perspective will bring as many changes to our world as ours brings to you. Jake looked out at the crystalline city spreading below them, its spires humming with harmonies that seemed to welcome him home. Somewhere in the distance, ancient monuments continued to pulse with renewed life, and he realized that for the first time in his adult life, he was exactly where he was supposed to be. You know, he said to Princess Lyralii, I should probably send Mr. Whiskers a postcard. He's going to have opinions about my new living arrangements, but I think he'll approve of the upgrade in defensive capabilities. Her laughter rang out across the observation deck like music made of starlight, and Jake realized that accidentally becoming a cosmic bridge between civilizations was probably the best career change he'd ever made, even if it did come with more prophetic responsibility than his original job description had mentioned. The universe, as it turned out, had an excellent sense of humor about these things.